All living things are made of just four things. Those things are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. We're going to talk about each one of those. We're going to start up in the top corner of your notes with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The smallest kind of carbohydrate is called a simple sugar. An example of a simple sugar would be glucose, which comes from plants. A simple sugar is also called a monosaccharide. Monosaccharide, if you break the word down, literally means one sugar. Mono means one, and saccharide is a word that means sugar. So one sugar is a simple sugar. It's very small. When you take some of those monosaccharides and you combine them, you get something that's larger called a polysaccharide. Poly means more than one, so it literally means more than one sugar. Another name for a polysaccharide is a starch. So when you think of starch in foods like pasta and bread, those are really polysaccharides, or long chains of sugars. Now, when you take sugars and you put them together to make a starch, or you take monosaccharides and combine them to make a polysaccharide, that process is called dehydration synthesis. It's called dehydration synthesis because when you combine two sugars, one of the oxygen from one of the sugars and then one of the hydrogen from one and a hydrogen from another combine. And so you have one oxygen and two hydrogen that leave the molecules. And when you put those three things together, two hydrogens and one oxygen, that makes water, or H2O. And so water is leaving when those two combine. So it's called dehydration synthesis because water leaves and becomes just a water molecule. And it's called dehydration synthesis because you're putting two things together to make one thing. Sort of like building a house, you take a lot of small pieces and combine them to make one big thing. So dehydration synthesis is when you take simple sugars and combine them to make a starch. The opposite of that process is called hydrolysis. Hydrolysis is when you add water to a starch or a polysaccharide, and because you have added the water, those starches are going to start to break into smaller pieces. You can kind of think about putting something in water and it starts to dissolve. It's similar to that. When you add water to a starch, it breaks up into simple sugars. On your notes, you have some pictures. These little rings down here are each a type of sugar, or simple sugar. So these are small carbohydrates. The first one is called glucose, the second is called galactose, and the third is called fructose. Notice that they all have this ring shape. That's what makes them a sugar. They have that ring. And they're each very small because they're simple sugars. Up at the top of that box, you have a starch. Notice that it has several different sugars strung together, almost like beads on a necklace. Now, in this picture, it shows dehydration synthesis happening. You have an oxygen and a hydrogen from one sugar combining with a hydrogen from the other sugar, and it makes water, and then that water leaves, and it leaves the two connected, so it makes a long strand of a starch. Some examples of carbohydrates for polysaccharides, so these are large carbohydrates, include starches. Potatoes are a good source of starch, and cellulose, which is found in cell walls. And cell walls are generally only found in plants. There are a few animals that have cell walls, but they're very rare. So cellulose is found primarily in plants. Another name for cellulose is fiber. So if you ever eat a Fiber One bar or something like that, what you're really eating is cellulose from plants. Now, because people don't have cell walls on their cells, they only have cell membrane, they don't have cellulose in their body, so they have to consume things like lettuce and vegetables to get that cellulose that they need. So these are polysaccharides. Some monosaccharides include glucose and fructose. Glucose comes from plants, and it's made through the process of photosynthesis. Fructose, you might have heard before in high fructose corn syrup. And high fructose corn syrup is very useful to companies that make processed foods because it is very sweet. In fact, fructose is the sweetest sugar that we have. And so they don't have to use as much of it because it is so sweet and it's less expensive for them. So fructose is used in a lot of processed foods. It also comes from plants. All right, the function in living things for carbohydrates include they can be broken down to be used as energy, and you'll learn later about a part of your cells called the mitochondria. When your cells need energy, the mitochondria take things like starches and sugars and they break them down to use those things as energy. Carbohydrates can also be used as structural support. I'm sorry, that word got cut off there, but that's support. And this only happens in organisms that have cell walls. So when they have a cell wall, then those carbohydrates that make the cell wall are used for structural support. All right, we're going to move on to lipids. Lipids are made of the same things as carbohydrates. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All lipids have two parts. They have a head that we call glycerol, and they have that we call fatty acids. Now, this lipid happens to have two fatty acid tails. Not all lipids have two fatty acid tails. Some have three, some have one tail, but they're going to have some kind of tail. Now, the thing that makes lipids unique is the fact that their head, or the glycerol, is hydrophilic. Philic comes, is a Latin root that means loving. If you think about the city Philadelphia, it's the city of brotherly. That Phil in Philadelphia means love. Hydrophilic means water-loving. The glycerol likes to be around water. The fatty acids, however, are hydrophobic, and we know it means fearing. So hydrophobic means water-fearing. So we have the lipid that is water-fearing, or and half of the lipid that's water-loving. So that means that water to a lipid, if you put it in water, then the hydrophilic glycerol will move towards the water, and the hydrophobic will move over. These are very large molecules compared to carbon. Now, you've probably heard of saturated and unsaturated fats. Fats are lipids, and here's the reason we call them either saturated or unsaturated. In this picture, you have glycerol here in red, and in the other picture, that was a blue circle, so you can imagine a blue circle here at the front. And then the orange tail that we had in the other picture is black in this picture. So we have the fatty acid tail and the glycerol head. We have the same thing down here, fatty acid tail, glycerol head. And notice that the tail in the saturated fat is straight, and the tail in the unsaturated fat is bent. That's because saturated fats have a straight tail. Unsaturated fats have a bent tail. And this has a lot to do with how your body digests this fat. That's part of the reason why unsaturated fats are better for you than saturated fats. So you can always remember that saturated is straight because they both start with S. Some examples of lipids include fats. Another name for a fat is a triglyceride. It's called a triglyceride because it has three tails. Tri, like in tricycle, means three because a tricycle has three wheels. So a triglyceride has three tails. Other lipids include oils like olive oil or vegetable oil, and waxes like the wax in a candle. Phospholipids are a kind of lipid that make the cell membrane. And also a phospholipid is like the picture that you have in the first box about lipids with two tails. Phospholipids have two tails. Steroids are another kind of lipid, and steroids aren't only those things that people take to make them better at sports. Your body also makes steroids, and one of the steroids that your body makes is cholesterol, and that is a lipid. The function in living things for lipids are they're used to store energy, just like carbohydrates.